These are the richest self-made black families in Toronto, and they built it in a city that never made room for them. We're talking about a man who bet almost everything on one stock and became Canada's only black billionaire. A boy from a Jamaican tin shack who mortgaged his own house to become the king of Bay Street, and a millionaire who fought the government for a decade to put a black radio station on the air. Let's get into it. Number 6. Ray Williams, the man who survived 30 years on Bay Street. Let's start with a man whose fortune came from the single hardest room in Canada for a black man to walk into and stay in, which is the trading floor of Bay Street. Ray Williams spent roughly 3 decades in Canadian finance and rose all the way to vice chairman of financial markets at National Bank Financial, one of the most senior positions any black executive has ever held in the Canadian investment industry. And to understand what that actually took, you only need one story he tells. At a luncheon, someone asked Williams whether, as one of the only black leaders in Canadian finance, he'd ever experienced racism on Bay Street. He said he nearly snorted his drink through his nose laughing, because he'd spent 30 years as very often the only black person in the entire building. The question wasn't whether he'd experienced it. It was whether there was ever a day he hadn't. His wealth came the way most durable Bay Street wealth comes, quietly through fixed income, currencies, and commodities. The unglamorous plumbing of the capital markets where the truly large money actually moves. This isn't flashy startup money. It's the compounding, 7-figure bonus, senior managing director money that comes from being trusted with billions of dollars of other people's capital for decades without ever blowing up. What people fundamentally misunderstand about a career like Ray Williams's is how much harder the climb was than the paycheck suggests. Success at the senior level of Bay Street depends on building what's called a book of business, the roster of major clients whose deals you run. And that book gets handed to you by the partners above you, who for decades have tended to mentor and promote the people who remind them of themselves. Williams had almost no one in the building who looked like him to hand him that first break, so he had to be undeniable on the numbers alone, year after year, until the results were impossible to ignore. And once he'd made it, he turned around and built the ladder for others, co-founding the Black Opportunity Fund to channel serious capital toward black Canadian businesses and communities. He didn't just survive the room, he propped the door open on his way through it. Williams spent 30 years earning his seat inside someone else's institution. There's a man on this list who refused to wait that long for a seat, so he went and built the whole building himself, and then he picked a fight with the Canadian government that lasted the better part of a decade. Number 5. Denham Jolly, the man who fought the government for a radio frequency. Here is a man who was already a self-made millionaire, already comfortable, already successful, and who then spent years of his life and a fortune of his own money in a grinding bureaucratic war, not to get richer, but to win a radio frequency. Denham Jolly came to Canada from Green Island, Jamaica, trained as a teacher, and then built his wealth the patient way, through real estate and healthcare. He bought a rooming house near the University of Toronto, then opened nursing homes, and for over 40 years he owned and operated a 210-bed nursing and retirement facility on a sprawling property in Mississauga, alongside medical laboratories and other holdings. That was already a serious fortune, built brick by brick in the least glamorous industries imaginable. But Jolly's real legacy is about a microphone. He watched Toronto's black community, one of the largest in Canada, grow through the 70s, 80s, and 90s without a single radio station that played its music or spoke to its life. He'd already put his money where his convictions were, buying and publishing the community newspaper Contrast in the 1980s, and founding the Black Business and Professional Association along with the Harry Jerome Awards, which still honor black excellence in Canada to this day. But the radio license was the fight that defined him. He applied for one, and the Canadian broadcast regulator turned him down, so he applied again, and they turned him down again. This fight dragged on for the better part of a decade, application after application, rejection after rejection, and Jolly kept spending his own money and his own years refusing to quit, until finally, in the year 2000, he won. Flow 93.5 went on the air as the first black-owned radio station in Canadian history. What people fundamentally misunderstand about Denham Jolly is that the radio station was never really a business decision. It was a cultural one, financed by a man wealthy enough to treat it as a mission. He'd made his money in nursing homes precisely so that he could afford to fight a battle that had no guaranteed payoff, purely because his community deserved a voice on the dial. He eventually sold the station years later, but the point was never the exit. Jolly proved that in his hands, wealth was a weapon he could aim at a closed door until it finally opened. Jolly spent a fortune he'd already made to win a fight that had no payoff. Someone else on this list came at wealth from the opposite direction entirely, moving so fast that he owned property before he was legally old enough to walk into a bar. Speaking of the mindset that values the mission over the money, a lot of it comes down to how the brain performs when it matters. That's the idea behind an audio series called The Genius Switch. It's based on the neuroscience of the flow state, that mode where focus and creativity click at the same time. And the whole routine is just listening with headphones a few minutes a day. It's a one-time $39, less than a single online course, and it's backed by a 90-day money-back guarantee, so you can test it on yourself with nothing to lose. If you're watching on your TV, pause and scan the QR code on screen with your phone camera, or tap the first link in the description. Now, back to number 4, and the fastest start on this entire list. Number 4, Isaac Olawolef, the immigrant who owned property before he could legally drink. Picture a young man born in Nigeria, brought to Canada at 4 years old, who by the age of 21 already owned his first piece of real estate, and by the time he was 29, had bought land directly across from one of the largest luxury malls in North America to build a condominium tower. That is the pace at which Isaac Olawolef moved. Olawolef grew up in the Toronto area, the child of Nigerian parents who, in his own words, sacrificed everything they had to give their kids a foundation, and he took that foundation and ran. He founded Dreammaker Realty in 2003 while still a young man, and rather than stay a simple brokerage, he did the thing that separates real wealth from a good salary, which is vertical integration. Today, Dreammaker isn't one company, it's an umbrella of them, spanning brokerage, real estate development, property management, wealth management, private equity, insurance, and education. He doesn't just sell the property. He develops it, manages it, finances it, and insures it, capturing profit at every single stage. His crown jewel so far is Dream Residences at Yorkdale, a major mixed-use development of condos, townhomes, and retail built directly across from Yorkdale Mall, with a reported string of further developments underway across the region, and a brokerage arm that has managed on the order of $200 million in real estate. He's leaned into the culture, too, with his development company serving as the jersey sponsor of Canada's senior men's and women's national basketball teams. But here's the move that shows he understands wealth on a deeper level than bricks. He founded BKR Capital, one of the first Black-led venture capital funds in Canada, specifically to write checks to diverse founders in tech, the exact people the traditional VC world routinely overlooks. What people fundamentally misunderstand about Isaac Olawolef is that he isn't just accumulating, he's building the infrastructure he wishes had existed for him. He said plainly that for the Black community to become economic leaders, it needs 3 things: strong institutions, more small businesses, and home ownership. And if you look at his companies, that's exactly what he builds: the developments, the venture fund, the wealth management arm, and the largest endowment for African studies at any Canadian university, which carries his family's name. He turned real estate into a machine, and then pointed the machine at his own community. Olawolef turned Toronto real estate into a machine and pointed it at his own community. But if you think starting with immigrant parents was a tough beginning, the man at number 3 started on a literal dirt floor in a shack and ended up with a nickname that tells you everything: the King of Bay Street. Number 3. Wes Hall. From a tin shack to King of Bay Street. If you want the most improbable rags to riches story in modern Canadian business, it belongs to Wes Hall, and the gap between where he started and where he ended up is almost hard to believe. Hall grew up in rural Jamaica in a tin shack, one of a crowd of siblings and cousins raised by his grandmother, who had almost nothing to give but love and a fierce work ethic. He immigrated to Canada as a teenager, and he started at the absolute bottom of the corporate ladder, as a mail clerk in a Toronto law firm. But he did one telling thing from day one. He wore a suit to deliver the mail because he had already decided what he was going to become. He studied how the business around him worked, moved into shareholder services, and then spotted a specific, lucrative gap: the messy, high-stakes world of corporate proxy battles and shareholder votes that erupt during takeovers and boardroom fights. So in his mid-30s, he used his own house as collateral to secure a loan and launched Kingsdale Advisors. And Kingsdale didn't just succeed, it came to dominate. Hall became the strategist companies called when billions of dollars were on the line, and his fingerprints are on some of the largest corporate battles in recent Canadian history, from the roughly $18 billion takeover of the mining giant Falconbridge to the $19 billion merger of Suncor and Petro-Canada. When a boardroom war broke out and a shareholder vote could swing a fortune either way, Hall was the man both sides feared across the table, and he earned the nickname he still uses, the King of Bay Street, with a Twitter handle to match. In 2014, he sold a controlling stake in the firm in a deal reported around $50 million, and he kept building from there through his private equity vehicle, We Shall Investments, along with holdings that have included an environmental services company, an industrial supply manufacturer, and a Hilton resort in St. Lucia. What people fundamentally misunderstand about Wes Hall is that the man who was long invisible on Bay Street, the mail clerk nobody noticed, became the single most visible advocate for cracking it open. After the murder of George Floyd in 2020, Hall founded the Black North Initiative, pulling the CEOs of Canada's biggest banks and corporations into signed commitments to put Black leaders in boardrooms and executive suites. Then he became the first Black dragon on the Canadian version of Dragon's Den, sitting in judgment of entrepreneurs on national television. The kid in the tin shack didn't just get into the room. He rewrote who gets to be in it. Hall got rich standing beside billion-dollar deals as the strategist in the room. The man at number 2 didn't stand beside the money. He ran it, building a firm that at its peak controlled $100 billion of it. Number 2. G. Raymond Chang, the engineer who built a $100 billion firm. Some fortunes on this list are measured in the millions. This one is measured differently because G. Raymond Chang didn't just get wealthy, he built an institution that at its peak managed $100 billion of other people's money. Chang was born in Jamaica into a family of Chinese, Jamaican, and African heritage, came to Canada, and earned an engineering degree from the University of Toronto before retraining as a chartered accountant and a chartered financial analyst. That combination, an engineer's precision fused with deep financial credentials, turned out to be the foundation of everything. He cut his teeth at the accounting firm Coopers & Lybrand, and then in 1983, he and some partners bought into a small Toronto mutual fund company that managed just $5 million in assets. $5 million. It was a minnow, the kind of firm that usually stays small forever or quietly disappears. Then Chang went to work, and over the next 3 decades that minnow became CI Financial, one of the largest wealth management companies in Canada. He served as Chief Operating Officer, then President, then Chairman and CEO. And by 2014, the firm he'd helped build from $5 million was managing around $100 billion. That is a 20,000-fold increase in assets under management. He became one of the wealthiest Black Canadians in history, not through a lucky bet or a viral product, but through the slow, relentless compounding of a well-run financial institution year after year after year. What people fundamentally misunderstand about G. Raymond Chang is where the money ultimately went, because he became one of the most significant philanthropists Toronto has ever produced. He gave so generously to Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson, that its business school was named the Ted Rogers School, alongside major gifts, and he poured millions into healthcare and into Jamaica, funding scholarships and institutions across the Caribbean. When he died in 2014, the tributes described a man who had quietly bankrolled an enormous swath of Black and Caribbean Canadian life. He built a $100 billion machine and then spent the back half of his life giving the proceeds away. Chang ran $100 billion of other people's money. The man at number 1 did something rarer still. He turned his own money into more than $1 billion, and he did it on a single conviction so reckless it nearly destroyed him twice. Number 1. Michael Lee-Chin, the only Black billionaire in Canada. At the very top sits Michael Lee-Chin, a man whose net worth Forbes places around $1.1 billion, making him, by every available measure, the only Black billionaire in Canada, and one of the most remarkable value investors the country has ever produced. Lee-Chin was born in 1951 in Port Antonio, Jamaica, to parents of Black and Chinese heritage, and he grew up in modest circumstances, the son of a mother who worked relentlessly. He came to Canada to study engineering, and legend has it he funded part of his education working as a bouncer, before eventually finding his way into the world of financial advice. And this is where his story becomes a lesson in nerve, because Lee Chin made his fortune on a single, terrifying conviction that if you own a few excellent businesses in strong industries and simply refuse to sell, you will win over time. Buy, hold, and prosper, he called it. In 1987, he acquired a small mutual fund company called AIC Limited, and he concentrated its investments with a discipline that made conventional advisors nervous. Where most fund managers spread their money across hundreds of stocks to be safe, Lee Chin did the opposite, holding a small number of businesses he believed in and letting them compound. Under his hand, AIC ballooned from tiny to managing something like $15 billion at its peak, and its slogan became his whole philosophy printed on the door: buy, hold, and prosper. But the truly staggering move came later. He committed enormous portions of his personal net worth, plus borrowed capital, into building his positions. And when the market crashed in the early 2000s and again in the 2008 financial crisis, the value of his holdings collapsed, and he was left heavily leveraged, staring at potential ruin. Most people sell in that moment. Lee Chin held. He was so certain of the long-term economics that he simply refused to blink. He eventually sold AIC to the insurance giant Manulife in 2009, but the anchor of his fortune had already become his controlling stake in National Commercial Bank Jamaica, the largest bank in his home country, and he came out the other side of two crises a billionaire. What people fundamentally misunderstand about Michael Lee Chin is captured in one bitter irony he points out himself. Despite being one of the only Canadians on the Forbes billionaire list, a titan by any measure, he has said he was never once invited to sit on the board of a major Canadian corporation, joking that he must simply be less appealing than the worst board member those companies could find. Sit with that. A self-made billionaire, and the boardroom still wouldn't make room. So he built his own monuments instead, pledging $30 million to the Royal Ontario Museum, where the Crystal Wing now bears his name, and tens of millions more to hospitals and universities. He didn't need their boardroom. He put his name on the skyline instead. And those were the wealthiest self-made black figures in Toronto: a billionaire, a $100 billion firm builder, a king of Bay Street, and the men who fought their way into rooms that were never designed to let them in. Notice what almost every one of them did with the money once they had it. Lee Chin put his name on a museum, Chong gave a fortune to a university, Hall pulled the CEOs of the country's biggest banks into signing commitments. Jolly bought his community a voice on the radio, and Williams and Olawolef built the funds to bankroll the next generation. None of them inherited a dynasty. Each of them started something they intend to hand down. In a city where the old money looks nothing like them, these men didn't wait to be let in. They built their own way to the top of the tower, and then they held the door. To keep uncovering the hidden stories of Black wealth, like this video and subscribe to Black Status.